Hello and welcome to a new episode, this time with Heikki Patomäki. Heikki is a professor of world politics in Helsinki. Previously, he worked as a professor at the University of Nottingham Trent and at the Global University of Technology and Design and Enterprise in Melbourne, Australia. He worked as a research director of the Network Institute of Global Democratization. His work and his books are based on critical realism, a relatively new theory that argues against individualism and positivism. This year, he published together with Thomas Forsberg an amazing book called Debating the War in Ukraine, Counterfactual Histories and Future Possibilities. It is a wonderful display of historical knowledge, analytical depth, and it shows the whole complexity and controversy of this war. Thank you, dear Heikki, that you followed my invitation for this interview.
Pleasure, thank you.
So let me begin with a more personal question. What did motivate you to study, and did you have any academic role models?
Well, it is always complicated to say that there's one particular role model. I'm almost embarrassed to say that when I was a teenager at the high school, and my role model was Albert Einstein. I was reading a book on him as both a scientist and a pacifist, and I really admired his work. And my original idea was actually study physics and mathematics rather than social sciences. And this is how I started my university studies, actually. And my dream at that time was to create a unified theory of the four basic forces of the universe. So I didn't start very modestly, but I think I chose very wisely when I actually moved from physics and mathematics to social sciences, first to economics and then to international relations. And the reason for that, the original impetus was very much related to the Second Cold War. This was in the 1980s, and everybody was talking about the threat of nuclear war. And I was also starting to play some kind of a role in the peace movement. And that actually motivated my shift from natural sciences to social sciences.
Sounds very nice. And what is your main area of research? Because in your books, you described this concept of emancipatory methodologies in international relations. And what is world politics? Why world politics and not geopolitics? Or so please explain us your main area of research.
Well, it's actually layered. When I started to study economics, I mean, the reason why I moved started to also think about philosophy quite a lot had to do with the problem that I saw in economics. Somehow it seemed unrealistic or detached from reality. These abstract mathematical models. As I had started my studies in mathematics and physics, I didn't find the mathematics particularly difficult, but I found it not to be particularly adequate for the study of a social world and particularly political economy. And I was at that point already quite interested in the global problems like the third world poverty, the environmental problems, and the specter of nuclear war. All these were part of my consciousness at that time already. And I didn't find the answers in economics, so I started to study quite a lot of philosophy to understand where the problem actually lies. And then I was also gradually shifting towards peace research and international relations. And at first I found political science pretty boring, to be honest, compared to some other fields. But then I advanced a bit, and I started to properly study international relations and international political economy. I mean, that was a new world. I mean, these people were looking at the whole world as a kind of a system in its own right, and how that evolves and so on and so forth. So I started to understand how the states and their relations are actually much part of a much bigger whole that is evolving and developing in different ways. Perhaps I'm now articulating that idea also in terms of the things that I've developed later. But nonetheless, I mean, that was the impetus why I moved shift first from economics to philosophy and then increasingly to international relations. The term world politics is broader than international relations or international studies. It also includes all those spaces that are not confined or defined in terms of the borders of the national states. So the starting point is that there exists some kind of a whole that is much bigger, and the various spaces and flows in this system are not necessarily determined or defined by the borders of the state. So it's not only interstate relations or international relations that matter, but these wider processes.
Very interesting. And what is your stance? I'm curious on the debate between normative and objective or positivist approaches, because in the natural science, hard science, they call themselves, they laugh at political science, they laugh at social sciences, humanities, and so on and so forth. They say, this is contingent and you cannot explain it. Theories are changing and so on and so forth. So what is your stance to this debate? Is normative science a bad sign? Is it not objective? Or what is your approach to this debate?
Well, I don't make any distinction between rationality and normativity. Normative arguments can be totally rational, and very often explanatory arguments in social sciences presuppose normative notions. In fact, truth itself is a normative notion. If you think about truth as a correspondence, it doesn't make sense if you think about that as a kind of a literal correspondence between the world and our conceptions of it. But rather, what we need to do is to understand that as a metaphor of correspondence that actually guides our practices. It's a normative notion. I mean, however much we have invested in particular theory or understanding, we should actually seek for contrary evidence and try to revise our conceptions and so on and so forth. I mean, so we have to try to make claims that are as close to the reality as possible, but we don't have any direct access to reality. But we only have our conceptions and evidence and so on. And within those, we have to make truth judgments. And truth itself is a critical and normative notion. And in fact, in critical realism, the basic emancipatory scheme is based on the notion of the truth.
Sounds very complex. So you add to the critical theory. So critical theory, we mean Frankfurt School, Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse, and many more. And you add the Michel Foucault or post-structuralist approach of language. So language is in between the world as it is. This is the realist part. The world as it is outside from my mind, from our language. And the language is in between, so to speak. So you have these three layers, 3 dimensions. Is it correct?
Yeah, that's correct. We can talk about reality, but different layers of reality are constituted in different ways. And so the world of the natural sciences, I mean, when we are talking about, let's say, water, for instance, I mean, we can have a real definition of water. I mean, you have the hydrogen and the oxygen atoms, and they are connected in a particular way. I mean, this is quantum mechanics, basically. And then the water has particular properties, and they're always everywhere exactly the same. So we can have a real definition of that. But in social sciences, what happens is that reality is in part also constructed by our understandings of the reality and truth. So truth is also in part performative and constructive. And so that has to be taken into account. We can also make references to constructive reality as well. It is also real. It's also different from my conception of the reality. I mean, it has been constructed by multiple actors through historical processes and so on and so forth. So it exists quite independently of me and my conceptions. But nonetheless, it is a socially constructive reality, and that has to be taken into account. And in critical realism, we actually make a distinction between ontological realism, epistemological relativism, and judgmental rationalism. And when we are talking about ontological realism, we have to be very careful about the nature of reality that we are talking about. So we need to also specify our social ontology, the things that exist in society in a particular way. It's relational, the processual sort of reality. that is also socially constructed, and it doesn't exist. The structures in society don't exist independently of our concepts and our activities. And so normativity is in that way interwoven into the construction of reality in a kind of a complex way. You're quite right, it is complicated. Somebody at some point said that God gave all the easy problems to physics. And we social scientists, we have to deal with these much more complex problems.
Absolutely, yes. So you are differentiating it from the pure realist approaches, and also from that type of thinking that, yeah, maybe there's skepticism, maybe there is a world outside, but even if there is, we cannot access this knowledge. And on the other hand, we have this social constructivism, who believe that everything is constructed in our minds, and in language is created by language, and power structures and hierarchy and everything. Our knowledge is constructing, so to speak, the world. And critical realism is a mix of both, maybe, and transcend them, and yeah. So
I would like to actually think about that in dialectical terms, that positivism and post-positivism in this constructivist sense come before critical realism, and critical realism is kind of a higher synthesis of them. So there's a movement, it goes into a particular direction. So it's realism, yes, but it's also critical, epistemologically critical, and also critical in the sense of critical theory. I mean, you refer to the Frankfurt School, for instance, and so critical realism can be said to be some kind of a fusion between critical theory in that sense and scientific realism on the other hand.
And I think it is a useful theory and approach to war and peace in the peace studies. We can use it. For example, there is, for example, if we see war on this dimension, that okay, there are resources, there are states and societies fighting for resources, and there are water scarcity. We know that in India and all the problems, and there are conflicts in Africa, for example, rivers defining two societies, and the struggle for water and other resources. Oil, for example, is a good example. Many argued that the Iraq War and many other wars are because of the Niger Delta, for example, and many other examples we can mention. So this is only one dimension. This is, so to speak, the realist approach. But then there is this narrative, how to legitimize, for example, racism in the colonial time. You have to argue that, yeah, Black people are not rational as we white people. So this is some sort of narrative. You explain the future and your actions because of the past and because of, some racist or, I don't know, narrative. So, and if we mix both, I believe that this is very fruitful for the peace studies and to understand why, states are going to war and how they legitimize it and many other things. Yeah, but
Indeed.
It's complicated. Yeah.
If you take your example of resource conflicts, think about water and rivers and those kinds of things. So for a critical realist, obviously the resources are very real, and the distribution of those resources. For instance, take the Israeli-Palestine conflict. I mean, the very skewed way of distribution water in that area is very much part of the conflict. But now, the thing is that there are no event regularities. I mean, this doesn't give rise to any sort of laws in the positivist sense of the term. So whatever the constellation of these resources and actors is, it doesn't give rise to some kind of a law that something has to happen. But rather, there are always multiple possibilities, and they are also constituted through different kinds of meanings, actions, and of course the structures themselves are developed in this process as well. So the structures that are relevant cannot be reduced to these material resources. On the other hand, the material resources are very much real and part of the complex that explains the conflict that we want to explain.
Absolutely. And from my understanding, Pierre Bourdieu and Anthony Giddens were two theoreticians in the field of sociology that tried to explain the relation between actors and structures. And this is very important because, like you said, it's contingent. some structures are determining the way of possibilities and the possible outcomes. That's true, but it's not deterministic. It's not one by one. So we cannot predict the future like, yeah, it's gonna be like this 100%. But on the other hand, we have actors who can, despite the structure, despite the narrow space or field in which they are acting, they have, a lot of possibilities, and they could act differently. So it's also a very interesting dimension.
Indeed, and we have to also bear in mind that structures are not only constraining. I mean, some of the path dependencies and some of the constraints might be related to structures, but structures are also enabling. They actually make it possible to have certain kinds of actions. These action possibilities, they have to be constituted, and by being able to shape the background of conflicts, we can actually shape the action possibilities as well and create a new kind of a dynamics. And this is very much part of the idea of emancipation in a conflict situation.
Absolutely, yes. And you argued in an article, or was it in a book, why you argued that we need to democratize global institutions. So here my question is, what power structures lie behind these global institutions? For example, we saw the World Trade Organizations, the World Bank, and even the UN institutions, and the so to speak, outrage of the global South. They demanded more room for participation and their voices to be more heard, and so on and so forth. So there is a debate between the global North and the global South. So after the Second World War, Bretton Woods, we know all the history, Washington Consensus, and so on and so forth. The West and the big empires and the big states shape the institutions. So in what sense can we democratize them, bring all on a table, and is the UN the proper global institution to do so? I have the hope.
These are big questions. In 1945, when the Second World War ended and the United Nations was founded, these 5 countries that now have permanent seats in the Security Council of the UN, they actually constituted the majority of humanity. The British Empire, the French Empire, the Soviet Empire, China, and the United States. I mean, these were a large part of the world. Due to decolonization, the situation has changed. And also after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I mean, Russian population is only about 2% of the world population at the moment. So now the Security Council looks very different in 2020s. That's only one perspective, but it's important to bear in mind. This has to do with legitimacy of the global institutions. So any attempt to govern the world economy, the environment, or the global ecological systems, or the health, or think about the also space that now constitutes a major part of the world economy. I mean, what can we do anymore without the satellites and the orbiting the planet and so on? All these systems, they have to be governed. And without some sort of a principle legitimizing that governance, it is very difficult to improve the capacity of these institutions to actually resolve the problems that we are facing, the humanity is facing in the 21st century. And not only that, there's a very likely decline of these institutions, and this is what we have been seeing during the past 20 years. So that's one aspect of the problematic. On the other hand, if you think about these global problems and start from that end, the question is also whether it is possible to create some kind of a world political community that would be able to sustain such institutions that can tackle many of these problems. And that kind of a world political community must be constituted on some sorts of principles. And given certain complex epistemological and other considerations, it is very hard for me to see any other way of legitimizing or giving justification for that kind of a community without democratic procedures and practices. And we have given up the idea that there are certain nature or God-given ways of ruling the world, and all these other principles that we can see in today's world typically presuppose a lot of coercion. And this coercion, when applied globally, very often lead to conflicts and escalation of conflicts. Democracy is ultimately also a peaceful way of resolving conflicts. And that's a very important aspect from a world political community point of view. Because it's such a big question, this answer of mine is necessarily very incomplete. But at least it's some kind of a starting point, so perhaps we can continue the discussion from there.
Absolutely. And in your book, I agree with what you said, but in your book, After International Relations, Critical Realism and the Reconstruction or Construction of World Politics, published in 2003, you argued also that there is some sort of universalism, so one-size-fits-all approach, for example, and here you quoted that many mainstream liberals argued and argue even today that a more peaceful world is possible if all states become liberal democracies. Here, for example, there is peace theories from Doyle, for example, from 95, and so on and so forth. I'm critic of this, not because I don't like democracies. Of course, I'm advocating that everybody should fight for democracy. On the contrary, but I see that many empires, for example, the British Empire and the US Empire and so forth and so on and so forth, they are democracies, but they are without with not a legal basis. They invaded so many countries. So one can criticize also this theory, that this naive theory that we need to democratize everybody and then we are in a happy world. So maybe
yes, well, I couldn't agree more. And one of the problems there is that there's false universalism at play, and this is what the classical political realists actually were warning about the liberals and their thinking in the 1940s, where there was a big discussion about the world state, and very often these realists, who were also in favor of establishing something like a world state, but they criticized the liberals for simply taking the basic ethos or basic idea of their nation as the universal principle of the cosmos, and then applying it to other places, other countries, other cultural contexts, and the outcome is violence, dominance, and hierarchy. So, and imperialism as well. So there has to be some kind of a critical reflexivity about the possible implications of claiming something like that democracy is a good thing and we need to democratize the world. And there are a number of aspects to this problematic here. One is obviously that very often democracy has been applied only with international states. So the United States is supposedly a democracy internally or domestically, but it doesn't apply the principles of democracy internationally. So that's one problem, that you don't apply democracy in that way. The other problem is that you simply take one model of democracy as democracy as such, which I think is also a problem. Democracy is not a particular model. Democracy is more a process of democratization, and it involves also debates about what the ultimate end of democracy is. So there are different possibilities. We have all these debates about participatory democracy versus the electoral or the representative democracy. But we have also the debates about the domains of reality where democracy should be applied, whether the economy should be democratized as well, or whether we only can apply democracy to certain aspects of state policies and those kinds of things. the neoliberals want to constitutionally constrain the domain of reality in all kinds of ways. So we have lots of debates going on about the proper area of democracy and the proper telos or ends of democracy. And that has to be taken into account as well. So global democracy, in my understanding, involves both. It involves the application of the idea of democracy across the world, not only within the domestic system, political systems of states, but in the world system as a whole, in the world society as a whole. But at the same time, it has to also be able to cultivate pluralism and experimentalism in different places, allow for this process to continue where democracy itself is part of the contestation within the political realm. And so these two, I think, should suffice to overcome this problem of false universalism in democracy promotion.
Absolutely. Before I ask you about the critical cosmopolitism, I want to add the tendency that we can observe nowadays, the securitization of politics. And you also published a book, The Political Economy of Global Security, and many other things. And there you also stated that the security is also can be a threat to democracy and the depolitization of politics. So we can see it, for example, not only OPEC with the oil and nowadays with China, that the ports, the economic relations are all under the term security. This is national security. So up till then you can debate, and there is even scientific work, but you cannot cross the line. This is not here scientific debate and democracy ends where security begins, so national security. So this is also a danger for science, also and also for democracy. And maybe we can touch on that. So this tendency of securitizations, we can observe it in the even climate crisis and many other things, migration, economic crisis. Yeah. So
and in that book, The Political Economy of Global Security, the key point is that the dynamics of the world economy actually very often leads to securitization, which becomes mutual. And therefore, it both restricts democracy, but also constitutes a danger in its own right, because it is a step toward arms race and ultimately to war.
Absolutely.
So yes, I mean, you couldn't be more right about that. The securitization is a key problem of the current system, and this is one of the reasons why democracy has to be applied globally. It can't be applied only domestically, because the system of states within the capitalist world economy tends to generate these conflicts that lead to securitization and thereby to restriction of democracy.
Absolutely. And here we have this dilemma in the realistic school. We have, for example, Morgenthau and many others. And here I quote you again. Morgenthau blamed Kant for the general decay in political thinking of the Western world and, in effect, for the catastrophes of the 20th century. He argued that the best way to preserve peace is to prepare for war. So here we have it. Security is the best weapon. And so this culture of being prepared and it's the security dilemma. We have it in the realistic school. So yeah, it's a dangerous game.
Yes, and the more one studies these things, the clearer it becomes that these things are interwoven. And this is the reason why in a recent book I started to talk about the three fields of global political economy, because the field theory seems to be able to take that into account. I mean, how things are actually connected at a very fundamental level, and how this field as a whole has its own dynamics. And it makes the problem of controlling, that's not a good word, shaping world history towards a more emancipatory direction, and also towards a direction that enables us to tackle these global problems that we've already mentioned. the more difficult. It is a very complex system, and the thing is to be able to find those critical points where you can actually make a difference in terms how history unfolds. And this is not the easiest task.
Absolutely. Yeah, maybe we can touch on that as well in regard to your latest book. Also, I wanted to add that because you mentioned the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, it is quite astonishing that these 5 members are at the same time the 5 states with the greatest weapon exports. So with the greatest military production and military growth, and militarism is key to these states. We see France have military bases in Africa. The US has military bases all over the place, all over the world, and yeah, China and Djibouti, and they are, and this is also a problem. So yeah, you cannot have a Security Council with, you know, that's the same like a drug dealer is in control of the pharmacy. So you cannot do this.
That's correct. And moreover, there are also the original 5 nuclear power states or nuclear weapon states, and that's also a big thing. In a way, the NPT treaty, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, is meant to secure the permanent monopoly over nuclear weapons for the into the foreseeable future. Of course, we know that India and Pakistan also are now nuclear weapons states, and that a couple of other states, Israel and North Korea in particular, have also nuclear weapons. But nonetheless, these 5 countries that have the permanent veto right over any decision that the UN Security Council is making are also the ones that are trying to secure their monopoly over nuclear weapons.
Absolutely, yes. And now let me ask you about the concept of critical cosmopolitism. What does it mean for the global identity? Why do we need, for example, a global identity, and how this can overcome conflicts and disputes and even war?
Yes, the cosmopolitan identity is necessarily multi-layered, and the ultimate layer has to do with the way we understand our place in the cosmos. And this is where the term cosmopolitanism comes. It means combining the word cosmos, the order of the universe, and and polis, which is the political community or the polis of the Greek city or ancient world, or the political realm of the contemporary world. So it combines the two. Now, the thing is that the cosmopolitans, if we look at the history of ideas, they've always understood themselves in the wider context of cosmos. So we are living in a relatively small planet that seems to be quite unique as far as we can see. I mean, there is no other place like this. I mean, this is full of life. I mean, this is like the haven of life in the very cold and gray cosmos. It's beautiful, but it's also very cold in many ways, also metaphorically. Whereas this planet is full of life, and we are interconnected to the Earth systems of life. Our human civilization, our states, our technologies, the economies wouldn't be possible without this world of life. And the understanding the planet and our place in that way has been a traditional basis for cosmopolitan thinking. That we can't see any center of the world, we avoid centrism in any way, because we can look and we can imagine looking at things from different positions, different parts of the surface of the planet, or even from its orbit, or even from the moon, or from Mars. But they are totally different places from the Earth. That's one thing. The second thing is this critical part. It has to do with reflexivity, and it has to do with this criticism of false universalism that we are talking about. Even though we can metaphorically constitute ourselves as part of this much wider whole, and see the planet as simply a planet of one solar system and so on, and our shared home in many ways. But at the same time, we have to be also critically aware that however we specify the meaning of this community is necessarily partial. And it involves potential conflicts with the others who have different ideas about how what our position actually in the universe is. Not only that, but the underlying normative principles are. We discussed, for instance, the issue of democracy. That's one part of it, but there are many other things. I mean, what exactly should be our rights? To what extent should we define normativity in terms of rights instead of some other notions that are equally important? What exactly is our relationship to the natural world? What does justice mean in this world? We have different normative conceptions, and there are all kinds of differences there. So when we go down the layers of our identity, we can see that however unified we might be at the more abstract level, when we go to the concrete levels, there are always plenty of potential for all kinds of conflicts, and the social world always involves conflicts as well. Now, that's another argument also for global democracy, in the sense that democracy is a peaceful way of resolving conflicts, and that's one aspect of it. But even the problem of democracy is complex because there are different understandings of it, etc., etc. So critical cosmopolitanism is reflexive in this critical sense of the term, trying to avoid false universalism, and whenever we are taking part in constructing some sort of positive alternative, we have to be very careful in not constituting something that might actually entail unintended consequences, including also potentially violent conflicts.
Absolutely, yes, it makes sense. In a lecture you held last year at the Austrian Center for Peace in Schleining, you described also the concept of this alien peace. I call it alien peace. It's also this shared global identity, but with a funny concept. Maybe not so funny. They are discussing it in the US Congress nowadays heavily. So maybe we're witnessing now this alien peace that also Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev were talking about, this extraterrestrial that are coming, and that so maybe we can construct the outside, the enemy, as the extraterrestrial. It's also a funny concept. And you mentioned that, and I was laughing at the first time, but then it makes sense.
Well, it is actually quite funny, and I have to say the speech that Ronald Reagan actually gave at the United Nations General Assembly in 1987 is quite fascinating. You can easily find it at the YouTube, and I recommend all the listeners to actually go and seek for it and see it. It is a fantastic way of formulating the problem. He was basically saying that imagine that there's an alien species threatening our planet, and then we would see how the small the differences are within humanity, and how we share a common humanity. I mean, Soviet Union was still in existence, and the Cold War was ending but still on. And in that context, I mean, it made a lot of sense. But then he continued, and what he said was also very interesting. And he said that there is actually already an alien among us, and that's war. And what can be more alien than war? Human beings killing other human beings. This is not some kind of a promotion of Ronald Reagan. He actually was himself taking part in decisions, the United States waging wars, and in Grenada and other places, in the night in Nicaragua and so on, the Central America in particular. And of course, the US was also pushing for the war in Afghanistan at the same time, supporting the mullahs and so on. But the idea itself, that there's something alien about war in itself, and then the imagination, or the imaginary, that there's some kind of a other force in the universe that might be threatening us. Now, just one further comment on that idea, that this is a typical Hollywood way of thinking about the aliens. that they come here and they threaten to kill us, and they have, however developed their technologies might be, they are just driven by their genes, and they want to eat us, or at least take our planet and all the resources, and so on and so forth. I actually think that I'm very much more in favor of the Carl Sagan vision about this, that if there's an alien civilization in this galaxy somewhere, which is very uncertain, but if there is, they would have survived the phase in world history that we are facing at the moment, which is that we have developed the capacity to actually destroy the planet, its ecological systems, and also the human civilization by means of weapons. And they have survived this phase, so they have to be ethically and politically a little bit more cultivated than we are at the moment. And and that might give us also another way of thinking about this in terms of aliens, something that we can aspire for. Now I lost you. I can't hear you.
Sorry. The German philosopher Richard David Precht tells that this is a joke in world history, that we are destroying our planet, and climate catastrophe is we are almost the distinction of human mankind is we can witness it, and it is a joke that we now are witnessing the threat of global nuclear war and world war, and and so maybe we we are helping this extinctions and so on and so forth. So it's tragic, but it's funny also.
it's funny, but it's also, you said the word tragic is captures some of it, but in fact, if you look at the processes of the past 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, the world economy has grown by the factor of 70 or 80, and this has entailed a lot of destruction. The use of fossil fuels led to global warming. I mean, very few of those people who actually participated in these original practices and the developments had any idea about what the consequences on a global scale would be. I mean, that was beyond the scope of their imagination. And even though some people were capable of speculating as much already in the early 20th century, we are a very small minority of human population, only very few people. They started to propagate these kinds of ideas. One of my favorites is H.G. Wells, that already by 1902 had realized that these technological developments will have very, very far-reaching consequences and will require a kind of a new constitution of our political community as well. And from that point on, he was always advocating the idea of a world republic.
Very interesting, yes. So let me go back to the question of identity. Here, I have two questions that I ask myself. First, how could there be a common identity between the oppressor and the oppressed? Because we should also be critical of this idea. Everybody should be happy. We are one family, but there is inside this family oppression and subordination and hierarchies and power structures, not only between men and women. We know femicide every year, thousands of women around the world are killed, and so homicide and so on and so forth. But not only patriarchal structures. There is militarism, and there is capitalism, and many other layers of oppression and hierarchy. So it is a dangerous thing to because we can keep a blind eye on hierarchies. So maybe you can
Well, I mean, that's the whole point of critical cosmopolitanism, that you retain your reflexivity and critical attitude even when you're trying to constitute something like a world political community. That you are not simply blinded by the idea that once there's unity, I mean, there is also harmony. The critical version of world political community that I've been developing actually involves conflicts throughout. There is no liberal utopia of harmony, never ever. And these conflicts are also productive. I mean, very often our knowledge, our understandings, etc., they develop through conflicts. That's a very important part of it. I mean, Nicholas Rescher has this beautiful book called Dialectics, a controversy-oriented theory of knowledge. And I think he's totally right that this is exactly how our knowledge is developing. We are questioning the previous knowledge, the claims of the others, and then there's a dialogue, there's a debate, and so on. The book on Ukraine is built on that idea as well, that there's a dialogue, I mean, different opinions, and then we can have reasoned debate among these and develop our understandings and cultivate our understandings. So it is very important to retain that critical reflexivity throughout, and without it, I mean, I go as far as to say that this is where the key lies for the future of humanity in this new book of mine, World Statehood, the Future of World Politics. And indeed, and I developed that in a number of different ways because reflexivity has different dimensions and layers as well. But the basic idea is very, very clear.
Absolutely. And I have to say your book with Thomas Forsberg is great because I love the way you approached it, and I love the way that you are debating. You are not agreeing on everything. You are seeing it from a different angle, from a different perspective. You are criticizing each other. You are adding something that the other left aside. So it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And also in the beginning, you explaining the concept of this counterfactual, also the method of asking questions. If you ask a simple question, I believe it was with Adam and the apple. So if you ask the question, what was it? Why Adam did eat the apple?
Yeah.
And this shows only a simple question, even not emotional. I'm not emotionally involved if you ask me why Adam ate the apple. You know, it's not like asking why Putin did invade Ukraine. So even this unemotional question can lead to confusion, can lead to a debate, and can lead to historical
Exactly.
uncertainty.
Because the simple question actually contains multiple possible questions. And it all depends on what we call contrast spaces. So we can ask, for instance, why did Adam eat the apple? So instead of Eve, for instance, or someone else. So that's one set of questions, and it's a different kind of a question. Then we can ask, why did Adam eat the apple, rather than make jam out of it or throw it away or something else? So why did he eat it? And then why did he eat the apple, rather than something else, like chips or a steak or something like that? I mean, why did he eat the apple? So this only indicates that within every question there are always multiple possible questions, and it is extremely important to actually specify the contrast spaces that we are talking about. And these contrast spaces also define, in our imagination at least, and partly and also in reality, the counterfactual possibilities of the past and the future possibilities as well.
Absolutely. And it showed all the dimension, all the possible narratives that are out there, and how the Russian elite are interpreting history and geopolitics, what are their interests. Then you differentiate also between the people and the state and the elite, and there are many layers and many narratives, and it's very complex. And so yeah, maybe it brings more confusion, but this is the point. There is not a monocausal, monolithic answer to the complex question. So yeah, I love the book. It was amazing.
Yeah, well, sometimes complexity can mean confusion also, and we can sometimes reduce complexity and make our claims simpler. But even when our argument is complex, sometimes we can still nonetheless summarize the thrust of the argument in a relatively simple manner, in a relatively understandable manner. So we have to operate at both levels. I mean, to allow the complexity to actually be discussed as such and analyzed as such. But then at the same time, we can also make these things, these claims, these conclusions that we are drawing clearer, more understandable to the wider population, because not everybody has the time and resources to focus on these things, I mean, for the good part of their lives. and they do other things, but they still have to be able to follow the debates and discussions and be aware and have this reflexivity and critical attitude.
Absolutely. What I found amazing is comparing to the public debates and to war propaganda from all sides and also from history. Showing the causes and understanding the causes of war is not the same as legitimizing this war. So understanding the aspiration, the motivation, and the interests behind some actions is not the same as legitimizing this action. I mean, every judge in the court will tell you this. You have to understand the motivation and so on and so forth, so you can judge the whole thing. And yeah, it's simple. It's common knowledge, common sense. But in fact, this leads to you have to sit down. It leads to work. It's a hard work to understand the whole thing, the whole complexity, the history. And here also from an analytical and scientific standpoint, it's also important where you start your analysis, from where you start, where is the starting point. If you see only the world history starting from the 24th February last year, so you have only this vision of a full-scale invasion, illegal invasion. But then you left outside the conflict. And here, Professor Werner Wintersteiner differentiated very well between conflict and between war. There is no debate when the war started, but there is a whole debate, even scientific debate, on the conflict. Why did the conflict start? Did it start in 2014? Did it start with the annexation of Crimea? Did it start prior the fall of the Soviet Union, and so on and so forth? So there is a huge debate, and you open up all these layers and dimensions in your book. So
there's actually also a special forum of globalizations, further developing some of these ideas, and particularly looking at this war in Ukraine also from a global perspective. So we are very much focusing on the history of Russia after the end of the Cold War, the 1990s, and the question of NATO expansion, the shock therapy in Russia, then the internal changes, securitization processes in the 2000s, debates about the color revolutions, and so on and so forth. But all these things are happening in the Europe widely conceived. In this special forum, we are also looking at the role of countries like China, India, Turkey, and Brazil in this conflict, and also thinking about the future possibilities to the extent that they could actually provide some resources for some kind of a peace deal, peace agreement. And also they could also play a role as mediators in the conflict as well. And some of them actively do so, like Turkey and Brazil, and China's role is extremely important in this conflict too. So it is very likely that the trade war and conflict with the United States, China versus the United States, is part of the overall causal complex that explains the possibility of this war. Because Russia couldn't have made this decision to invade Ukraine without at least counting on some sort of support from China. However tacit, however indirect, but nonetheless, economically speaking, it has been very important for Russia.
Absolutely, yes. And you also mentioned internal and external factors. Internal factors, the power structure in Russia, the oligarchs, the state-sponsored capitalism, and many other layers, corruption. From a feminist perspective, we can add patriarchal system. Then from a historic materialistic perspective, we can add the resources, the fight of resources. A few days ago, maybe today, China announced China announced the restriction of the export of gallium and germanium, and a EU study showed that China accounts for 94% of the world's gallium supply and 83% of germanium supply, and these two elements are crucial in the technology, in the microchips. So without this, you cannot have a military that is functioning, and artificial intelligence, nanotech, everything is dependent on this. And we saw that Germany, Netherlands, and the US, Japan and the US are the top importers, the top importers of this materials, and previously to that, these countries announced that they want to tackle China's ambition for tech development and tech dominance. So this is a huge, and Adam Tooze, economic professor of economics, stated that this is an economic war between the US and China. So he goes even further and say this is a war. So yeah, well, you have all these layers. Yeah,
it is. Well, it is a little bit dangerous to say that it's a war already, because I mean there's also the possibility of very literal war between the United States and China. But what we are seeing is a process of securitization, which we talked about earlier. But this is happening at the level of these great power politics and geopolitics on a global scale. And this is exactly how the dynamics of security dynamics leads towards something that I would call the global insecurity community. So we don't have a global security community at the moment, but we have an insecurity community. And this is a step toward a global military catastrophe, a major step. I mean, step by step, these countries have been securitizing a number of issues, including the access to raw materials, but also to markets and the certain technologies and many other things as well. They are also using these financial platforms and other things for as like weapons. So some people talk about weaponized interdependence, and that's I think a better term than war itself, because it's not actual war, but it's weaponized interdependence combined with the processes of securitization, paving the way for a major military catastrophe globally. And the book that I wrote in 2007, 2008, the Political Economy of Global Security, already envisages the possibility of this happening on a global scale, China, US playing the key roles there. There were some misjudgments about the role of the EU in particular, but otherwise, I mean, unfortunately, the worst scenario, what I call scenario A, seemed to be the one that has been realized by this time, and that we are still continuing along the same path. I think this is very worrying, and I hope that my work and people who have been making similar kinds of arguments over the years would have at least some influence at some point on world history, that we could somehow affect some critical points in world history to shape it a little bit away from this particular course, steer it to some more desirable, more emancipatory direction. And this is the task that I think critical theorists are facing at this point in world history in the 2020s.
Absolutely, I hope so. I hope so, yes. I was proud of myself because I published in 2018 two articles, and you argued in the same direction in the same book. And I argued that the Russian economy started with neoliberalism, with shock therapy, neoliberalism, and then it moved to a more authoritarian form of state capitalism. Big state-owned corporations owned, the critical infrastructure. Oil industry, gas industry, Gazprom, we know all this stuff. So, and the second article was arguing that there was a mechanism of external influence and some sort of a fight or how can I say, a competition between the European and the Russian integration project. Russian had also this Eurasian free market with Kazakhstan and many others, and Belarus, and the European Union had its own interest and integration. We know the 2014 association agreement with Ukraine and many others. So we have this economic sphere of influence, soft power, as Josef and I would say, and we have many other layers. And also you both, and this is an outsider argument, in my opinion, if I see the whole debate in the public sphere. You both agreed that NATO expansion was one of these many factors that created tension, and that was also a mistake. And you are right in saying it like this. Dissolving NATO was one possibility. So, and here we are again back to what we said in the beginning. Social actions, political actions can be reversed, can be, contingency is an important concept here. It could be different.
Oh yes, with Thomas we do agree that the 2008 declaration that Ukraine and Georgia will be NATO members was a unnecessary provocation and led to very negative consequences with relations with Russia. This is true. We differ, however, on the way we understand NATO expansion more generally. Thomas is much more favorable toward NATO expansion, if I put it that way, and I'm much more critical, and I've been critical of that since the 1990s. I thought that it was already in the early 1990s as a very young scholar. I was arguing against it and also in favor of the idea that there should be more room for Russia to be different. Not in this way necessarily that you violate international law and invade other countries, but I mean that was a foreseeable possible consequence of the policies that we adopted by the Western countries vis-a-vis Russia, and that was not particularly wise. I mean, it was a possibility that was totally lost in the 1990s. So the end of the Cold War could have meant tremendously positive developments in the world system, and unfortunately there was too much continuity on the Western side, and these opportunities were missed.
Absolutely, I totally agree. And even you said in the book that there could be a different kind of, for example, European Union, including Russia, and there could be a different form of NATO, also including Russia and China, if we want to state, that every state is included, or dissolve it. So there are many options also in this regard. But I saw and I observe it that if you follow the line of argumentation of Carlo Massala, Andreas Umland, many others from the Green Party, and many other actors that are shaping in a crucial way our public debate, you will hear the counter arguments. You will hear that choosing your alliances is in the free world, international world, is crucial for democracy, expanding free markets, and you hear a counter argument, and also okay, maybe we can have a debate on this, but they are even saying that who is criticizing NATO expansion is playing by the playbook or repeating Putin's war propaganda, and so this is a kind of, even I saw it in the peace studies, and this is dangerous. I mean, here, in my opinion, here the scientific debate ends, and polemic comes into play, and unnecessary emotions and division. It's a pity if the debate ends here.
It is, and it is also totally contradictory, because these same people also believe in the Western universal ideas about democracy and human rights, and at the same time they seem to be totally committed to the idea of state sovereignty, meaning negative freedom to do whatever you want. And this latter, even though it's also an aspect of the OSCE and international law more generally as well, the OSCE, the Helsinki process from 1975 onwards, and then the Paris Charter of 1990 and the subsequent documents of the OSCE, they were based on the idea of common security, and particularly the latter documents. And the common security means that you can't have security at the expense of other countries, other players in the system. And given the contradictory nature of these documents and international law, it is not particularly easy to interpret that in the context of NATO expansion. But one possible way of building a bridge between the the standard liberal understandings and the concept of common security is to use John Stuart Mill's concept of no harm principle. That you are free to do whatever you want, but you can't cause harm to others, right? And the NATO expansion, particularly since the situation started to be increasingly conflict-ridden, the NATO expansion started to be increasingly harmful. And there was no justification for that if this interpretation of the OSCE principles is correct for NATO expansion. This has nothing to do with playing with the playbook of Putin and Russia. I mean, this was the common agreement among all the OSCE countries at the end of the Cold War.
Absolutely. And also I observed some sort of double standard, because if everybody is free to choose the security alliance, why was the US so concerned about the Solomon Islands entering a security pact with China, for example? So it is controversial, you know, but don't waste time. Let's don't waste time on the Western double standard, because everybody who is watching politics carefully know that. I wondered if you still hold the position that implementing the Minsk II agreement could lead to a more, you know, could prevent this war and could lead to more stabilization in the region, because many argued that Ukraine, like the Finlandization of Ukraine, and could not stop the Russian imperialist ambition. And you also agree that Russian has some sort of imperialist, is an imperialist actor. So yeah, so where to draw the line? What is the guarantee? We have to ask ourselves critically, what is the guarantee that Russia will not try it again, you know, influence the elections, corruption, and yeah, take Ukraine into its own sphere of influence? So it's yeah, where to draw the line, and where is the guarantee?
Well, that's correct that the second Minsk agreement, had it been implemented, would have been, or at least very likely to have been able to prevent the war. At least the second part of the war. Compared to the situations after 2014, the Minsk agreement would have actually guaranteed the sovereign territorial rights of Ukraine, because then the Donbas area would have become again fully part of Ukraine, even though as an autonomous part. And from the perspective of Finnish history, which has given also rise to this term Finlandization, I have to say that my own interpretation of what Finlandization involves is slightly different from the standard Western way of thinking about it. It was a highly successful strategy in the case of Finland after the Second World War. It also guaranteed liberal democracy in Finland, not only liberal democracy, but also social democracy, and in some cases also radically participatory democracy as well. Finland was a mixed economy, and the cooperatives played a big role in the Finnish economy at that time, and there were all kinds of very interesting developments. And one part of those agreements was also the neutral position of the Åland Islands, or demilitarized position of the Åland Islands as well. And this is not so dissimilar to what some of the arrangements in Ukraine would have been. And the Finlandization, of course, during the Soviet era involved some Soviet interference in some aspects of Finnish politics, particularly those concerning Finnish relations with the Soviet Union. But apart from that, Finland was totally free to do whatever was democratically decided. And the case of Ukraine might, of course, be different given the level of corruption in Ukraine because of the fragility of democracy in Ukraine and so on. But I still think that the Minsk agreement would have been a major improvement compared to the situation from 2014 to 2021 before the Russian invasion to Ukraine. So that would have been the basis at that point. Nothing is optimal, and I understand some of the concerns that the Ukrainians have about the arrangements, and and the way power relations were defined in this constitutional draft and so on. But nonetheless, I mean, their reluctance to constructively engage in negotiations about implementing it, I think, was a major mistake. And now the situation in 2023 obviously is very different. And what I've been proposing at this moment is to think about these occupied areas in eastern Ukraine as a demilitarized zone governed by the United Nations. That's the best solution I can imagine, at least as a kind of a basis for negotiations, to try to deterritorialize the question. So neither Russia nor Ukraine would have direct access to these areas, but there would be a long period when the UN would like reconstruct normal life in those areas, including in terms of rule of law. And then after diplomatic negotiations and referenda in these regions, there would have to be the decisions about the future of these regions. This is only, of course, an idea about a possible direction for the negotiations. It's ultimately up to Ukraine and Russia, and then also the Western countries to take part in these negotiations and determine the final terms. But at least this provides a positive and constructive idea about how we could overcome the territoriality of this conflict.
Absolutely, absolutely. One thing I missed in the book, maybe I didn't read it carefully, was your stance and the debate between you both on the topic of the Maidan event. How do you frame it? How do you understand what was happening at the Maidan in 2014? Was it a coup d'etat, or was it a revolution, a democratic revolution? Because it was a violent, I mean, here is a broad agreement. There is no doubt about it. It was a violent overthrow of a democratic elected president. Here we can agree, but there is the debate. I believe that in few months, a book by Professor Ivan Kachanovsky, professor from Ottawa in Canada, will be published with his scientific, conclusion what was happening at the Maidan, and he came to the conclusion that this Maidan revolution happened violently with the involvement of neo-Nazi groups in buildings that are controlled by the government. So it is a tricky situation how to frame it, how to understand what was happening. We know that the phone call that was public exposed then from Victoria Nuland. We know that there are some sort of interest and foreign involvement. So I believe I didn't find it in your book, but what is your stance? What is your stance? And maybe you know the position from Thomas.
Yes. Well, I think Thomas looks at this more from the side of Russian playing a very critically important role in these developments. That it was somehow personally important for Putin to actually be involved in the Ukrainian politics, and that they were playing behind the scenes in a way that was not legitimate, etc., etc. My own understanding, actually, I've been trying to avoid saying something very concrete about the precise events. I mean, when you look at who exactly did what in those days when it happened in the Euromaidan, because there are murky waters. I mean, it's very difficult to see who precisely did what. But what is very often not taken into account is the political economy developments in Ukraine before that, and how that is related to wider developments in Europe at the same time. This was the time of the Euro crisis, and the Ukrainian GDP collapsed by something like 14% just before the Euromaidan. And there was the currency crisis in Ukraine. The central bank's reserve were basically out. The Ukraine tried to get loans from different sources. The IMF granted loans to Ukraine a number of times with very stringent conditions. austerity plus anti-corruption. Ukraine failed to meet these conditions time and again. And then the European Union came in and they also offered a loan, kind of a rescue package for Ukraine as well. But the terms were very similar to the terms that Greece were receiving at the time of the euro crisis, which would have meant actually a decline of the Ukrainian economy in a very serious way. And many actors in Ukraine were totally opposed to the EU economic policies on the grounds what they have seen what is happening in places like Greece. And this criticism was particularly dominant in the eastern parts of Ukraine. So it actually correlated with the other cleavages in Ukrainian society. And that was feeding into the conflict between different parties. And then obviously both the EU and the United States were playing a role in the conflict, and Russia as well. And they used different methods, etc. Russia actually promised a much better deal for Ukraine, at least as far as the overt conditions are concerned. The much lighter conditions and much bigger loan, $15 billion at that time. And the Yanukovych was very willing to take that loan rather than the EU loan. And that provoked the whole thing, because in the western part of Ukraine, there were many who were vehemently opposed to any Russian involvement in politics, etc. So that was the beginning of the conflict. We have to understand also the political economy processes that fed into the process. I think that's more important than to understand who exactly did what under these very complex circumstances, and where there were also people pretending to be someone else than they actually were, and there were all kinds of debates about the precise procedures and legal rules and many other things as well. So I agree that the ousting of Yanukovych was unconstitutional.
Absolutely, yes. And one line of debate that you both had in the book, it was very interesting for me, because I heard the same arguments at the yearly gathering of the peace scholars and activists in Austria called NEFCR. And there I heard the same argument on the subject of Westplanning, on Ukrainians' own subjectivity is denounced by peace activists, because the argument was like this, that there was a public poll that showed that the majority of the Ukrainians want to fight. And then on the left wing, if we heard the speeches and the analysis from, for example, Professor Noam Chomsky, he provoked the public debate with stating, I believe he referred to US general or politician in the US Congress, I don't remember exactly, but he stated something like the US is willing to fight until the last Ukrainian. So we have a polemic debate on this topic of subjectivity. What do we mean with Ukrainians? What kind of subjectivity is on the line here? Who wants to fight? I thought this is a very important, but also a very tricky question, because do we define Ukrainians only by the state and the state media, the elites who are running the government, or do we understand Ukrainians that are fleeing the country? I mean, there are millions of people around the world now, especially in Western Europe. I also saw a figure, but I cannot prove it. Maybe I'm wrong, but I saw it that the UN published that there are 3 million Ukrainians also in Russia fleeing to Russia. So maybe I got the figure wrong, but there is no debate that people are also fleeing to Russia, especially the Russian, the Ukrainians who speak Russian or are ethnically Russian. So this makes it more complicated to understand the subjectivity Ukrainian. Who is this? I mean, me as an anarchist, I'm not an Austrian. I don't feel like a patriotic Austrian. So who is this? What is this? What are we talking about?
Well, the use of collective or names for collective actors is very often misleading. In a divided society like Ukraine, it's always complicated who can actually speak on behalf and in the name of Ukraine. the war unifies though, and we know that after the invasion, Ukraine, the remaining parts of Ukraine, we are unified in terms of this war. Not that everyone agrees. I mean, there's a peace opposition within Ukraine. There's a lot of censorship. The many left parties, particularly those somehow connected to Russian cultural or other interests, they've been prohibited in Ukraine. So the appearance of kind of a homogeneous will is, of course, partly manufactured as well. But it is also true that the war unites. I mean, if you are bombed, and obviously the first thing that comes to your mind is that you hate those people who are bombing you, right? And so there's a lot of hatred, anything Russian in Ukraine at the moment, and this hatred unifies, and the Zelensky, of course, is in a way personifies this current situation in Ukraine. But I agree with you that this question is complicated. However, I've been always trying to emphasize that whatever peace agreement there will be eventually has to involve the Ukrainians in particular. So even though there are other actors that are involved anyway, including the US and NATO and the EU, and Russia, of course, but their potential mediators and Turkey, etc., China, they all play a role in one way or the other. But the Ukrainians has to have some kind of a key role in these negotiations and in the agreement. This concerns first and foremost the Ukrainians. After all, the war is happening inside Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are the ones who are suffering most from this war. And this is something that we have to bear in mind. Even though this simplification in terms that the Ukrainians alone can decide and they have to decide, I mean, they are totally dependent on the Western aid. So if the Americans and the Europeans are saying that now it's time for peace agreements, I don't think that the Ukrainians have much to say about that.
Absolutely. My last question, because I saw that time is running. What I was saying about the Chinese resources and the trade and the conflicts between the two big powers, this backed up your thesis, your hypothesis that the US turned in, I believe you said in 2008, turned to unilateralism and neo-imperialism, like you said, and this is likely to be a critical world historic conjuncture because others will respond, and it opens up a new era of competing imperialism. I don't remember exactly from where I got this quote. I believe it was an older book.
The Political Economy, Global Security. Yeah.
Yes, my question is why you said that the tipping point was 2008. Why not the 9/11 invasion after the 9/11?
No, in fact, in that book, it was precisely 9/11 and the Bush younger government and the invasion of Iraq and so on, and that was the neo-imperial turning point. I later actually changed my mind and said that the real saddle point was the global financial crisis of 2008. That anticipated it, it precipitated some of these developments that we've been seeing since then in the past 20 years. But the saddle point that deepened these tendencies was the global financial crisis. And but it's true, in terms of Russia, it was actually the early 2000s developments that were decisive, because Russia very quickly responded to them. Not 9/11, I mean, for a short while they had some kind of a shared interest there, but particularly the invasion of Iraq was a kind of a major turning point, and that was immediately followed by the so-called color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine. And that led to rather different developments in Russia. It was also at that point that the Russian economy started to be growing again, and they started to approach gradually the level of the Soviet standards of living in Russia. And so Russia was regaining some of the resources it used to have, or Moscow used to have, only some of them, not all of them, but some. And anyway, so this combination was changing the scene inside Russia. I have to admit, though, that in the political economy of global security, unlike in some of my other writings, I didn't take that fully into account how it will actually affect Russia in particular. And when I changed my mind, I was still thinking about these wider developments, including China and the bigger global geopolitical scene, where Russia is only one player among others. But when we look at more closely the Russian relations with the West, I think the decisive turning point was in 2003 and 2004.
Interesting. Yes. This leads to my next question: is should we begin to speak about the permanent economic growth? Should we speak about capitalist expansion of of markets and the competition between markets, between states, between corporations? Should we open up this critical debate?
Well, obviously, and I think there are many political economists who are doing that all the time in various different ways. And in my works also, I mean, I'm talking about commodification and decommodification quite a lot, and the creation of markets. I mean, not necessarily I'm actually relying on different sources. I mean, sometimes I draw some things from the Marxian tradition, but very often from other traditions, post-Keynesian, Polanyian, so a number of different sources, and also, of course, critical realism and its social ontology is very important for formulating and framing some of these points and arguments that we are making. And then, of course, concrete historical empirical evidence is decisively important as well. But yeah, we are talking about the expansion of particular kind of market society at the moment, and which can be called capitalist neoliberal market society. And and it has very particular consequences. And the question is not, I don't believe, I mean, this sense I owe a lot to Roberto Mangabeira-Unger, who is very critical of the deep structuralism of Marxian way of thinking, that there's one system that stands and falls as a whole, as one single whole. I think that it's an evolving whole, and there are all kinds of practices and institutional arrangements, legal principles, etc., that are unique to particular different historical eras, and the dynamics of it changes accordingly as well. It can be also reformed and changed from the inside, and thereby we can open up new possibilities. And the whole point is not simply to replace one system by another. One much better metaphor is to think in terms of changing the course of history. I mean, the path that we are taking, the path that we are now on is very dangerous. And we need to change that, and there are various ways of doing it. And those ways have to be reformist, but they have to be reformist in a way that actually enable other reforms. So in that sense, we can talk about radical reforms.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. We see it with resources, we see it with climate crisis. So there are many tipping points, and we reach them all. We saw it. We see scientific papers and scientific knowledge is out there, but nobody is listening, it seems to. So, and yeah, so yeah.
Well, I mean, there are many people who are also listening. And I know that there are also many grassroots movements that are taking this very, very seriously. And there are all kinds of international negotiations going on, and there's a lot of talk about green transition, etc. But it's also the power structures of the world economy that are playing a decisive role here. So think about the energy transition. I mean, the fossil fuel industry is playing a key role there, and this is also part of the outcomes that we are seeing.
Absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, this was my last question. I thank you very much. I appreciate the talk. I learned a lot from your books, and yeah, thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you for this discussion. It has been very nice.
It was a pleasure.